morning and welcome to Mental Health Matters with me, Dr. Audrey Tang. It's the show where we take a deep dive into all things mental health and well-being. Today's topic is sex, and sex across the lifespan, sex and well-being, and why it's so important. But also, we're going to be talking about a very important subject, and that is sexual rights as we get older. Because there is an age group that is being missed out when it comes to information, talking about sex, or even opportunities to actually find a forum, find a safe space to explore problems, explore issues. So to help me unpack all of this is a researcher whose work has been pioneering this field. It's Professor Sharron Hinchliff of the University of Sheffield, who has created the Sexual Rights Charter and whose work was recently recognised by the United Nations State of the Population report. But before that, we were invited to the Fitness Collective in Bedford. And we spoke to Coach Dan Frammingham about what he's doing to support everyone's individual fitness journey across ability, across age, and across the lifespan.
So the FitCo's been here for about 8 years, but I took it over just under 2 years ago with the aim really to help people build strength, reduce pain and improve their quality of life. That's really I guess the stamp I've tried to put on it. I think one of the things I've noticed within working with people for the last 20 years is a lot of people come and they have little niggles in their knees, their back, their shoulders, and 9 times out of 10 it's probably because they're not very strong enough. So that's one of the things that we've tried to do is that, when people come in, is to help them reduce those niggles that they would have, and help strengthen the weak areas, and subsequently, it helps improve their quality of life. We have, I would say, probably 80% females. I think one of the things that, being in the gym space for the last 20 years is, like you said, there's a bit of a stereotype that, it's guys, lifting heavy weights. And I think because we've made it's like a private space, there's no mirrors. You can only come in here if you're working with a trainer or you're in a small group. People come in here, obviously they pay that a little bit more. They get free coffee. There's respectable music on there. So I think people feel welcome to come into this space knowing that it's not going to be crowded. They're going to be able to access the equipment. They've got attention to detail from their coach. So I think generally, my experience, guys generally think that they know more than they do in the gym context. And women probably don't have that confidence. They think they can't do as much as they actually can. So I think when they come into this space, quite quickly they realise that, oh wow, I can actually do this. And having a coach alongside them, whether it be a small group or one-to-one type stuff, just helps them, and it's really helped us to grow our community and help people get stronger, reduce their pain and improve their quality of life. I've recently turned 40, so for me this is, in many ways, this is all I've known. I remember watching World's Strongest Man when I was 4 years old, and I remember 4 or 5, taking my top off and going, oh, I want to be a strong man. So as cheesy as that sounds, I think that when I left school, I just wanted to work in the gym environment. So I started my PT qualification when I was 18. Did that for a number of years, then transitioned into actually a teaching environment. So I used to work for a college in London. That's where I'm originally from, and used to teach what we call NEET young people. So kids not in education, employment or training. So that's 16 to 24-year-old, and I actually used to teach the fitness qualification for a number of years. Then when my family and I moved to Bedford, I transitioned back into PT. I've always done that, but transitioned back into working in a private space, one-to-one stuff, with the hope and dream that at some point I'll be able to have my own premises. And the opportunity opened up a couple of years ago. Yeah, here we are. Social media, I think there's pros and cons to it, which has massively impacted, well, it's impacted every sort of sphere of the sort of social settings we find ourselves in. But I think when it comes to the fitness space, I think some of the sort of the pros to it are it's made it accessible to everyone. I think with YouTube and stuff, you can quite easily access 10-minute workouts. You see, especially sort of for females, you see, females lifting heavy weights, and there's not this thing, I'm going to get bulky and I'm going to sort of, look masculine or whatever it is. Whereas before, I think people sort of from my generation, if I've worked with people sort of in their sort of 30s and 40s, like, oh, I don't want to lift weights, I don't want to get big. But then they realise, 6 months in, oh, I'm just stronger, I'm more athletic. So I think that has definitely helped it. But then on the flip side, I think the same thing I said is a good thing is also a bad thing. Everybody is putting content out, and there's no sort of, I guess we would say, sort of regulating body that can govern, is this good stuff, is it bad stuff? And I think, I always say, like, sex sells, right? And if you've got people who are, very minimal clothing, whether it's male or female, looking quite lean, athletic, straight away people take that, oh, they must be an authority within the industry. Whereas 9 times out of 10, they're probably not. They've just got very good people who are marketing them and trying to sell them. We want to ask as many questions as possible. We want to make sure that people are trying to find as much information from people as possible in order that we can actually best help them. And I think for me, what I always try and do, especially when I work one-to-one with someone, is keep things really, really simple. So we want to make sure that, if you say that you've got, I don't know, an hour a week to work out, well, if we can say to that person, okay, let's make sure that we are giving you something that you're able to do that's sustainable moving forward. So if you've only got an hour, okay, well, let's start with maybe half an hour, and let's be consistent at that. Let's try and do that for a month. Even though you probably could do more, let's do that for a month, build some consistency, get some momentum, and then maybe go to an hour. Or if you've got 2 20-minute windows, let's start with that. So I always say to people, what's the worst week you could have? What could you do in that worst week? And then from there, let's try and build some consistency rather than say 5 times a week, let's go. 9 times out of 10, that people don't really normally do that. So we try and keep it super simple. And I'll always people rather leave here feeling that they could do more, and then they come back that they can actually do more, rather than feeling completely exhausted and then leave here feeling, oh, I feel dead. So I think, if we can encourage people to hit 70, 80% effort levels consistently 2 to 3 times a week, consistency is king, and it will compound it over time. You'll see results from that.
Definitely a lot of fun with the Fitness Collective. And now it's over to our holistic therapist, Jennifer Mckenzie, to talk to us a little bit about how we can connect better with our bodies.
Here are 3 ways that you can develop a deeper connection with yourself. Number 1 is scheduling me time for relaxing, play, self-pleasure, creativity, whatever you feel like. Make some time just for you. Schedule it in your diary. So you make sure that you've got that slot just to spend some time connecting, journaling, being with yourself, getting to know yourself on a deeper level. Number 2, move your body. Close down your eyes, get into your body and move however your body wants you to move. Maybe go and put on your favourite song or put on some relaxing music and just let your body be your guide and get to know physical touch. Move your body, noticing where you feel stiff, in pain. Notice where you feel good as well. Number 3, be honest with yourself. Now this is a good one. Are you really happy? Are you abandoning yourself and your own needs in order to help please other people? So it's checking in with yourself, observe your behaviours, your thoughts and reactions, but without judgment. And being honest with yourself about who you are, where you are, and showing up authentically as that person.
Welcome back to the show. It is my absolute privilege to have Professor Sharron Hinchliff joining us today. She is a professor at the University of Sheffield. She has championed the Sexual Rights Charter. She's also had her work recognised by the United Nations, and it's wonderful to be speaking to her. Welcome to the show, Sharron.
Oh, thank you. It's really great to be back.
I love having conversations with you, especially around this topic, because it's the topic that needs to be talked about more. That's what your work is all about.
It certainly is.
So can you, I know we've had the pleasure of chatting before, but could you tell our viewers a little bit about the work that you do and why sexual rights, especially across the lifespan, are so important?
Yeah. So I'm working at the University of Sheffield, where I lead a programme of work that looks at sexuality, sexual health and well-being, and ageing and gender from kind of midlife and beyond. So that involves doing research and teaching and a lot of kind of work with partners external to the university. But we all work together in a collaborative way to try and tackle the stereotypes and the discrimination that we can experience or we can face in terms of our sexuality as we get older, because there's a lot of myths and misinformation out there and people feel a little bit embarrassed, or they don't know where to go, they don't know how to talk about it, services don't know how to provide that support. So the whole ethos of our body of work is really trying to tackle all of that and just to support people to have conversations so that they can get the help that they need.
This is really key because you've kind of answered my next question, but I'd like you, if you don't mind expanding on it, is it a case of discrimination, or is it just people are not trained? Is it that the information isn't available, or is it some kind of mix of all of that? Because the problem is this lack of information, but we don't know where it starts.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's such a mix of that. I think there's information out there, but it can be hard to find, and that's one of the reasons why we set up our agesexingyou.com website, and that was based on the research and talking to older adults as well, and just saying that where do we find out the information about any possible sexual changes with aging? Because the information, like I say, is out there, but it's often embedded within a health condition context. So if you haven't got that health condition, if you haven't had a stroke, for example, then you won't identify with that. Or if it's on the sexual health websites, which are really fantastic, by the way, they tend to be kind of aimed at younger people. Even though the message is that the sexual health advice is for everyone, when you look at it, the images and the way that it's talked about are really, really directed at younger people. So again, older adults just don't identify with that. So it's finding the information that's out there, I think.
And related to that is, and your website is fabulous, I really love it, but sometimes older adults also aren't online. So you've created the Age of Love cafes where people can meet face to face. And that was part of what was celebrated in the United Nations report. Could you tell us a little bit about the success of those cafes and what you've been doing within them?
Well, that's right. Yeah, I mean, we are trying to tackle this from all different angles. So like you say, it's about being able to communicate and share knowledge about sexual health and well-being that is not actually online, and reach the community in that kind of, I guess, that creative way as well, because you really brought a creative aspect to our Age of Love cafe in Northampton. But that's the whole ethos behind the cafes, is that we can provide a safe space for people to have conversations about relationships, about intimacy and about well-being. And it's a learning space as well. So it's a bit like a menopause cafe, but with a different focus.
Yes. And I like your point about the learning space, because I think you almost get that when somebody shares something, somebody else says, oh, actually, I experienced that, and they don't feel afraid to say something anymore. Why do you think people are so afraid to bring this up to their healthcare provider?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question.
Sorry, Judith.
No, I think we've got two things going on. I think we have some that feel that experience barriers to seeking help, professional help, because there's reasons of embarrassment, maybe being afraid of what it might mean. You know, is it indicative of an underlying cause if they are experiencing a sexual issue? You know, a lot of people do wait to see if it gets better on its own. But then at the same time, we've got some barriers that we get from the health professional side as well, in that if they're not raising the topic, if they're not providing that context for people to ask the question about sexual health and well-being, then that in itself can be a massive barrier. And we hear about the kind of the patient that's seeking help for a sexual issue, but they actually seek help from a GP about 4 or 5 times before they actually disclose. So they actually go in with the intention to ask about it, then they like sort of get a bit frightened and change their mind, and then it takes a few consultations before they actually do that.
And also, this is something that was really enlightening on your website, where you speak to people and find out about what actually is going on. And I think this speaks to your point about there being a lot of misinformation out there. Now, before I got to your website, my thinking about some of the dysfunctions, say for men as they get older, would be erectile dysfunction, because that's what we see advertised on for pills or whatever on television. And yet, reading your website, what you'd seen and what people had said to you was it wasn't so much the getting the erection, it was being able to orgasm. And it's things like that, which unless we speak to people or people speak, we don't find out about. Is there, what other misinformation is there out there that you've come across?
Oh gosh, well, I guess the first one is the assumption that as we get older we lose interest in sex, and that predominantly applies to sort of women at menopause. There's the kind of assumption that you get to menopause and then you lose your sexual desire, and I've actually heard younger women talking about this and being frightened. They just assume that's going to happen to them. They're really frightened that they're going to lose sexual desire at menopause. So that's one of the kind of misinformations that we want to sort of readdress, if you like, because not all women are going to lose sexual desire. Some women do experience a dip and then it comes back. For some women, it's more problematic. But, you know, there's a lot of myths and there's misinformation. But like you say, having those conversations helps us to tackle those.
Great, and we're going to be talking about the menopause in our next segment. But could you tell us a little bit about the Sexual Rights Charter and how it needs to be implemented in society in general?
Yes. So our Sexual Rights Charter, we launched that just a couple of years ago, so in 2022. But it does aim to start a conversation that matters about sexual health and well-being as we get older. So currently it is being used in healthcare. So we're using it as a basis for CPD with nurses who are training to work in primary care. So that underpins the training there to develop their confidence and competence. But you're right, we need to tackle this from different angles. So we are using it in the community as well, and it underpins the wellbeing cafes. And the idea is really just to empower people to actually ask about a sexual issue if they've got one, to sort of break down some of those barriers around communicating about this topic, because let's face it, it is a private topic. It can be really sensitive and it can be embarrassing. You know, and when we think about gender aspects as well, for men to admit that they're having problems with their, you know, erections, it can be demasculating. For women to feel like they want to talk about their sexual issues, there's all sorts of gendered kind of assumptions around that. And, you know, well, why are you still interested in sex at your age? And there's all sorts of things that create these barriers. So if we can try and tackle them at the community level as well as at the sort of healthcare and social care level, then I think we're going in the right direction. But that's the aim of the charter. It's just a broad charter that can start that conversation.
And it's a conversation that needs to be had. Now, I'm really delighted that Professor Sharron is going to be staying with us. But first, we're going to pop over to our sex therapist, Madina Demirbas, who is going to be talking to us about sexual dysfunctions in men.
Hello, today I would like to talk about sexual dysfunction in men. And when I say men, I don't refer it in a binary form. I'm quite aware that sex and gender are on the spectrum. I'm rather talking about man or woman, referring to the sex assigned at birth. So, there are 3 different stages at which a person can experience sexual dysfunction, and they are the desire, the arousal, and orgasm, the climax. So at the first stage, when there is a sexual dysfunction with the desire, a person has lower than usual or no interest in sex. That is typical for this person. It's very different from asexuality, which is in general no interest in sex or in sexual orientation. At this stage, when a person is experiencing sexual dysfunction with the arousal, we need to look at the physiological symptoms, and I always advise to have a test, a certain test, especially the testosterone level test and other hormonal tests, but also we're looking at the psychological side of it. If it is lower than usual, could it be the sign of fatigue, of stress, or certain problems in the relationships at home or at work, or any other areas? Because it is quite typical that our body would shut down as a response to another side of the problem, to a problem in another aspect of our lives. So the stage number 2, which is arousal, is the dysfunction happens when a man might have a desire, but then has hard time keeping the erection to the level that was initially planned. And again, in this case, we're always advising to have a look at the physiological side and to make tests, but also to look at the psychological side. And with the physiological, we know that with age, the inability, the chances of not being able to maintain erection, which is called erectile dysfunction, is increasing. But it also can happen at any age, just like any other sexual dysfunction issue. It happens with everybody at a certain stage of their lives. So this is normal. When we're talking about psychological, again, could there be psychological side of erectile dysfunction for that matter? We need to look at what is going on with the person at that moment psychologically. Is there performance pressure, or is there some kind of resentment that hasn't been told earlier to the partner or partners for that matter? So with the physiological side, there are different treatments such as medications, surgery, and hormonal treatment. And with psychological, I always advise to combine these two because very often they're connected. And with the stage number 3, which is orgasm, it is when the person has the desire, able to maintain the erection at the desired level, and then has problem climaxing, experience the orgasm. It is also it could be a physiological side effect of certain medications and certain type of surgeries, but again, it could be the sign, surprise, surprise, of a psychological state of a person. And in many cases, it is the inability to climax could be the sign of inability to take pleasure in general, and that's why we are checking. We're looking at the bigger picture of whether a person is able at this point of his life to experience the pleasure and the climax of other activities. And the general advice that I always give in sexual dysfunctions is to understand that this can happen to anyone at some point of their lives, and that it could be the sign of another problem. Sexual dysfunction issues are always, are most of the cases, they're indicator of a bigger issue that you need to address, which is happening underneath. Thank you.
Welcome back to the show. I've still got Professor Sharron Hinchliff with me, and we've been talking about the Sexual Rights Charter that she's been pioneering. We've been talking about her work when it comes to sex and well-being across the age span, and some of the misinformation that's out there, and how healthcare providers could be trained a little bit better and are being trained better thanks to the Sexual Health Charter, but also why we need to have these conversations even more. Now, one of the things that we started talking about was menopause, and that's something where there's been a lot of documentaries, now about it. But even then, it doesn't cover everything, and there are still so many individual experiences. Professor Sharron, do you mind taking us through a couple of the different experiences women may have when it comes to the menopause?
Yeah, well, it's certainly a hot topic at the moment. Pardon the pun, but we're hearing so much about the menopause and learning so much about it, which I think is really, really great. But I think what we need to remember is that there are some diverse experiences when it comes to the menopause experience, because when, not all women are the same, and there's going to be differences. I could experience menopause differently to my mum experienced menopause, and she would experience it differently to her mum as well. But one of the things to remember is that not everyone has symptoms. I think there's about 25% that don't have symptoms at all. And then that means there's about sort of 75% that are experiencing symptoms, and about a third of those will have symptoms that are really debilitating and have an impact on, quality of life and being able to get to work and just your relationships and things like that. So I think the differences are really there, and we need to hear more about them. And one of them I've already mentioned about the sexual desire. Not all women are going to have experience a difference in their sexual desire as they get older. But we are being kind of led to assume that that's the case, because we are hearing that message quite strongly.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing, which I know we've talked about, and I know we know what we mean when we talk about menopause, but a lot of the symptoms tend to be in perimenopause, with menopause being the bit where the periods actually stop. And could you break down that distinction a little bit? Because I would actually think that most people going through the symptoms are actually experiencing the perimenopause symptoms. I could be wrong, though. So
yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. So I'm talking about women that are going through natural menopause. So women that are hitting menopause around age 51, and it hasn't been sort of medically induced by any treatments, and they haven't got premature ovarian insufficiency, which is the sort of menopause that happens really, really early, can be from a very young age as well. So thinking about the women that are going to hit menopause about age 51, we do go through a stage called perimenopause, and that can start around age 40, maybe even earlier, because our bodies start to change in terms of our hormones, but we might not notice them until we get into our 40s, when we start feeling the symptoms, which there's quite a lot of symptoms we can experience. There's the hot flushes, there's the night sweats, we can have aching kind of bones, aching joints, headaches, migraines, that's one of them. Our heartbeat can race. So we start to experience the majority of the symptoms, if we're going to experience them, when we're in the perimenopause, when that's age in our 40s. And then the actual menopause itself is just this tiny period of time, because menopause is defined as when we've been 12 months amenorrhea. So 12 months amenorrhea is 12 months without a menstrual period. And then after that, we're post-menopause. So we hit the 12-month date, no period, we're in menopause, and then we're post-menopause after that. So the symptoms can continue afterwards, but I don't think they're as strong as they are in the perimenopausal period.
This is so important. That's so important to have that knowledge. Thank you for sharing that. And so relating to that, at the Age of Love Cafe, where I had the privilege of hearing you speak, we had somebody raise their hand and say that she'd raised some of the concerns she was having, the symptoms she was having, including lack of libido, so lack of sexual desire, to her GP. And her GP had turned around and said, well, that's because of your weight. And then, if that's not bad enough, another woman put her hand up and said, oh, yeah, my GP said that as well. So what happens when we go to our GP and we explain these symptoms and they say, oh, it's your weight, oh, you're stressed, oh, you're this, oh, you're that, oh, you're something else. How do we push for that conversation?
That's so interesting, isn't it? And I'm not quite sure if that was the GP's way of sort of avoiding talking about sex.
Yeah.
We'll just blame the weight. Easier to talk about.
Terrible, isn't it?
That's absolutely true. But I do think going forward, because there's a lot more chatter in society and there's a lot more training that's been developed for health professionals. So I think that GPs and other health professionals are going to be better informed. But until then, I think one approach is to be forearmed. So if we go into the consultation, with information, we might have an article that says that this can happen during menopause, and you can present that to the health professional and say, look, I've found this, and I think this is what's happening to me. So that's a way of broaching the topic, but not only that, you're presenting evidence to support what you're saying, so it's harder for the consultant or the GP to shy away from.
Yeah, I agree totally. I remember having to do something similar to this when I was low in iron, which also gets worse during my periods. And I actually had to go to get my iron tested privately and brought that evidence to the GP, and finally they said, oh well, we'll send you for a test now. So it's really quite a lot of evidence that you need, isn't it? Or it feels like it sometimes.
Yeah, it can feel like a bit of a battle, and that's certainly something that I've heard with women that have wanted help and they've gone to the GP and they feel like they haven't got it or they've been dismissed. So I know that there's some real issues that need addressing out there. Which
is a lot of what Professor Sharron's work will do. Now, is there ever a good time to start talking about the subject of menopause with a healthcare provider? So, for example, learning what the possible options might be for us, or do you think it is best to wait till we have symptoms? What would your thoughts be?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because in my research, I know that the women have said to me that they don't think about the menopause until it happens. Now, whether that's going to change because there's so much conversation about it now, and like I said earlier, I've been hearing women say that they're fearing losing their sexual desire. They don't want to hit the menopause because then they'll lose their sexual desire. So I think any time when we get into our 30s and definitely in our 40s, we can start having those conversations. I think if you inform yourself early, then you know what to ask when the time comes, if indeed it does come that you need to have that help. And one of the things that I always advise is do a bit of reading. And NICE, so the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, they have a set of guidelines for the public about menopause, and that has information about menopause, available treatments, lifestyle factors that can help you with the symptoms. It also talks about help seeking as well. So I think that's informative for public, but if you meet with resistance from your health professional, then you can literally give them the NICE guidelines and say, look, this is a conversation I need to be having with you. So for me, it's about preparing, make a list of your symptoms, make a list of any sort of things you want to try to help with that. And, maybe even sort of consider booking a double appointment so that you've got that longer time period to have that conversation.
That's a very good point. And with those guidelines as well, that can be maybe helpful with trying to explain that to partners and families as well, because that can be a difficult conversation where we've had our sex therapists talk about how couples sometimes, if somebody doesn't feel like having sex, the other person might feel rejected. And of course, it's not psychological, it's physically how we're feeling. And so would you say that the guidelines are kind of user-friendly enough to have those conversations?
I think there will be. I think there will be. But saying that, there's going to be different levels of health literacy. So they might be more suitable for some people than they are for others. So to bear that in mind. And I think this is where we need to really work on making sure that materials that we've got for the public are inclusive, that they're accessible. And, we might need easy to read versions as well for some of our communities. And because we do find, you asked about an area that I'd like to see more work being done. And that is one. There's communities, I think, that are being neglected when it comes to information about menopause.
Yeah, I mean, do you mind sharing which communities that are struggling at the moment? I know different cultures will have different access as well.
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking about the learning disability community.
Yes.
And there is information out there, but I think with the conversations that we're having in society at the moment, then those kind of communities don't come up. Do you know what I mean? It's
the assumption.
Based. Yeah. Yes, it's based on the assumption that we've got this woman that's pretty healthy and that's going to hit menopause at age 51, and then all this information is relevant for you. So we need to consider that kind of that diversity, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And also we've had Louise Bates on the show from the Alzheimer's Society, and she's talking about how they're working because the LGBTQ plus community also has different experiences, especially with Alzheimer's when it comes to sexual rights, because if you have in Alzheimer's jump back to a time just for that moment in your mind where it was illegal to have homosexual sex, then that can be really traumatic for you when seeking help. So you're absolutely right to bring up all of the communities that do need that extra support. Related to what you've been saying about how these young women are scared about menopause, it kind of links to this real negative stereotype of aging. There's anti-aging, there's anti-this, anti-that. And one of your blogs is brilliant. It's about sex symbol Joan Collins, who, from another woman, was described as, she's a sex symbol. If you had sex with her, she'd fall to pieces. I mean, what can we do about these stereotypes?
Gosh, there's so many. And I think for women, we get the ageism and the sexism colliding, and it creates this double whammy that we have to fight against. But there's a lot of women that are doing just that, and it's fantastic because now we've got social media, and you just have to look at things like Instagram, and where there's women that are really sort of defying them stereotypes and calling out that kind of negativity around aging and around being an aging woman, and they're doing this in a really visual and accessible way as well. And one of my favourites is Cindy Gallop, and she's got a TED talk, and she talks about older women and casual sex. So she's really sort of challenging that stereotype that sort of women get to midlife and they have, they're quite sort of settled in their relationships and they just have one partner, and things like that. But I think from my own perspective, some of the most inspirational people that I've met have been midlife women. Brilliant. Have been really happy to speak openly and honestly about sexual well-being, to talk about how they feel empowered and stronger once they've got through the menopause. They might have had a really tricky menopausal time, but they feel different at the other side of it. And it's been, that is one thing I love about my work, because I get to meet all these really strong, amazing, powerful women.
I love it. I love that. And that's so inspiring as well. So just before we let you go, Professor Sharron, do you have any tips for us to be better advocates or better allies when it comes to raising these topics and calling out the stereotypes?
Yes. So I think when we're calling out the stereotypes is really important. And one of the kind of, which we'd class as ageist, but we might not be sure it actually is until we think about it, really. But it's the one, you look good for your age.
Yes. yes. Such a backhanded compliment.
It's a backhanded compliment, yeah. So you think, oh, it's a compliment, it's really nice. But it is backhanded because it's kind of saying you look good, which is a positive thing, but for your age, which is negative because it's kind of implying that getting older is bad.
Yes.
So I think the one way we can deal with that, we can respond to this by just being really clear and, saying thank you. Oh, I love being 58. Yeah. Oh, thank you. It's, it's such a good age to be.
Yeah.
So we can directly call it out and say, that's not a compliment. But I think it's just acknowledging it and being really clear about it, either saying that's not a compliment or just swinging it around. Yeah. So that it is actually a compliment, but in the proper way.
Yes, managing that narrative. Thank you so much. It's been so great to chat with you, as always. Please join us on the show again. It's such a pleasure. We are going to be sharing with you a clip of her giving the keynote at the Age of Love Cafe in Northampton.
You might think I'm obsessed by Viagra. I'm actually not. But there's two reasons. I mean, Viagra did change the sexual well-being landscape in that it gave the public a language to talk about sexuality and ageing, and that was a really big deal at the time. People didn't know what to say, they didn't have their words, they lacked their confidence, and a lot of people struggled in silence. And secondly, you might know this already, but Viagra's approval in America by the Federal Drug Agency was one of the fastest on record. And that says a lot about men's sexual pleasure. And indeed, that says a lot about women's sexual pleasure for the past 100 years, because the majority of the funding and the majority of the attention and research has been focused on men's sexual pleasure, not women's. So there's an inequality that's been around a long time and that's still around today. So in my early project, when everyone was asking me about this, I had to talk. I was tasked with talking to people about their sexual activity, and I'd never talked to anybody about sex before in my life, so that was quite a straight in, feet first, talking to people about intimate things. But I did learn a lot, and one was about the power of human connection, as we've just been hearing about in that reading there. Absolutely amazing information about how powerful it is to connect with another human being. And one woman in her 70s who really sticks in my mind because she couldn't, or they weren't having sex for various reasons, health reasons, but she talked about the power of touch and how important it was to keep on touching. You know, playing footsie under the breakfast table, or just the touch on the shoulder as you walk past each other, and how that conveys such powerful meaning in the absence of that kind of sexual intimacy. But we know that touch has got proven benefits to our health and well-being. You know, there's scientific research that tells us it strengthens our immune system, it regulates our nervous system, and it can help us to heal, and that is through the release of happy hormones. I've been looking into this, and apparently if you hug with someone, I can't work it out whether it's 7 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds or 2 minutes, all the data is different, but if you hug someone that you love, then it starts to release those happy hormones. But also we know about human connection taking place on like a sexual scale as well, and the participants that I talked about referred to the benefits to their health and well-being from being sexually active with their partner. They talked about benefits such as a boost to their self-esteem. Women in particular talked about the boost to the self-esteem from being sexually intimate in their sort of 40s, 50s and beyond. Because we know that things like our body image and our self-esteem in general can take a hit around midlife, especially as our bodies are changing. Sometimes, you know, you feel like, what's going on here? Different things that start changing with the hormonal changes. And one example, this morning I stepped in the shower perfectly fine, and I stepped out with a bad hip. And I don't know what I'd done. I literally stepped in, got washed, stepped out, my hip started hurting. And it's like those unpredictable random things that happen to your body as your hormones start changing, as they start depleting. But another thing the participants talked about was how much it keeps the relationship on an even keel. So being sexually intimate regularly with your partner can avoid a lot of those arguments, and indeed was often used as a tool to avoid those arguments with a partner, and we hear that. We hear that no matter where we conduct the research, whether we've conducted research across Europe, in the UK and in Australia, we hear the same things whenever we do that.
I thought the right topic here would be to talk about what happens if you experience age discrimination. And these are tips from Indeed.com. Again, I've got them written down so I get them right. First of all, we need to know about the types of age discrimination that might happen. And there is direct discrimination. Direct is very straightforward. Your contract's terminated because of your age. It is things like that. Or deliberately being told, well, if you're over that particular age, you can't apply for this job. That is direct discrimination. Encouraging you to take retirement can also be a form of direct discrimination. It may also come under indirect. So indirect is a little bit more subtle. So this is like Professor Sharron was saying, sometimes you may not realise something's ageist until you really go away and think about it. So it's things like an unfair policy or rule that's come in, or that's been there for a while, that has a worse effect on some people. So for example, we're introducing this wonderful new training, but it's only available to you if you have graduated in the last 5 years. So I'm not saying it's not possible for someone past a certain age to graduate. People are going to university all the time, which is wonderful, but it is more likely that a younger person would fulfill that criteria and older people may well be excluded. So be aware of that kind of discrimination. Then you get harassment. Now, this can be aggressive and intimidating. It can be bullying. It can also be more like subtle microaggressions, such as comments about age being banter. And, oh, you won't understand it because you're too old or too young. So just be aware of that as well. And then there's victimization. Victimization is when you speak up, you say something and then suddenly you're treated worse. So again, be aware about that. All of those 4 types, completely unacceptable, and you will have legal recourse. So what I would suggest you do, and this comes from the ACAS website, so do visit www.acas.org for more support, but keep evidence. Talk to your manager or talk to somebody who has the capacity to be able to deal with the situation. However, if they are involved, it might be you have to talk to HR. Try to resolve it in the first instance without it going to a formality. It might even be a process in your organisation that you have to do it that way. However, if there is no response or no response to your satisfaction, be aware you can always escalate it. And I come back to the ACAS website. www.acas.org will be really, really helpful to you. So be aware that it's not just you that may be experiencing it. If you witness it, and remember this is all about being a good ally, it's all about being a good advocate as well. If you witness it, also speak up. Those are the methods in which you can do so. It's about being that ally, about being that advocate, even when the person isn't in the room. Welcome back to the final part of the show. This is the bit where Jude and I reflect on the key things to take away. And as I'm flying solo today, I will have a think about some of the things that I believe are really key points. And if you take away nothing else, these are the key things to think about, at least in my humble opinion. It's about the evidence, and it's about being able to call people out with that evidence. If you experience discrimination, if you experience something from your healthcare provider or GP that you weren't expecting, if you come with evidence, that can be really helpful. And there is support out there. The NICE guidelines they're useful. Menopausesupport.co.uk is another helpful resource when it comes to menopause, and they have a booklet which also allows you to talk about your symptoms. It's a symptom checker. So, research, find evidence, and keep speaking up. The more we do it, the easier it gets, and the more people join us. So thank you so much for tuning in. See you next week.